Jon Vest is the Extension Agent for Floyd County with the Virginia Cooperative Extension. His expertise helps novice and experienced farmers produce quality livestock and crops throughout our region. Jon has offered to share his experiences with our audience and provide them with the knowledge to keep agriculture strong. This is the Ag Show with Jon Vest.
On a wonderful day like we have today, with the sunshine and the opportunity to get out there pruning, we have to ask ourselves, why do many even consider pruning a necessity in the landscape or in the home orchard? Largely because we need to decide upon whether we're growing for aesthetics, and in this case, the trees behind us were once a beautiful wall of white flowering material every spring of the year, versus are we growing for fruit production or home fruit production in our small fruit and or tree fruit materials, or are we pruning for a particular design element or uniqueness to our particular landscape that no one else might have? For instance, are we trellising? Are we doing living borders or living fencing through our pruning process? Are we trying to achieve a particular type of topiary that once again draws to that landscape interest and may add value to our home and landscape? So there's numerous reasons in which to prune beyond that of simply the health of the tree and or the food or fruit production of those tree fruit that we're enjoying in our home landscape. If they have optimum fertilization or typical fertilization available from the landscape, they are stealing every bit of your turf fertilization away from the soil that they're rooted in. So usually the trees are winning the battle over turf, and if you're applying out in your lawn or landscape, they are getting a dose of the material up the tree. This tends to push for lots of upright or unnecessary growth like what you see in the tree here. That's not the reason, though, that you see the overall prolific amount of straight up growth. What we're dealing with here is a pruning operation that, in the importance of getting the tree down and reduced in overall size for an APCO easement, the level of pruning necessary to bring it down resulted in lots and lots of upward growth. More than a third of this tree's canopy was removed originally, and what this has resulted in is, for those of us that are wanting to prune it back into shape, we have to address this tree for as many as 2 and or 3 seasons after the initial pruning so we can get this material thinned and back down to a reasonable amount of canopy that is supportive and healthy for the tree. In the case of shear selection, there are those of us that use shears often enough that having an ergonomic design, particularly this handle design here that swivels, and so as my hand closes, it allows me to make that cut. So as that base swivels with my hand, it relieves that pressure, or many of the pressures associated later in life with carpal tunnel syndrome and additional situations from repetitive use injury. So yes, while the shears may be slightly more expensive, it makes for a wonderful improvement in design. On occasion, you'll find those opportunities where our normal hand shears are simply not capable of getting the cut made, and it's important not to attempt those cuts because you're quite easily break your hand shears. At that point, where we start to range from the thumb size up to an inch, inch and a half, we really ought to start thinking of the appropriate pair of loppers to make that next cut that we're talking about. That said, there's lots of lopper designs out there now. There's both ratcheting heads that allow us to have more strength and then creating the cut necessary. There's also those like I'm holding here that have that extended handle design where I can slide them out or slide them back in for ease and maneuverability in and around the tree that I'm going to prune. Looking back into the tree here, I have a slightly larger shoot, once again, growing straight up right here. If I want to choose the lopper size, I chose the larger pair, and I'm going to make the cut once again at the branch collar right there at the base. As you can see, once again, allowing this type of material to grow up on a horizontal limb is now adding at least 8 feet to that overall weight distribution necessary for the tree to withstand. During ice and snow loads, landscape trees like what we have behind us really do suffer from the added amount of ice weight, and that's how storm damage then occurs. It causes these shoots to overweigh our scaffold branch, and then we have the splitting and damage that typically occurs. Viewers, we have before us 3 examples of pruning saws that you may have either purchased at your local supply, or you may have picked from your grandfather's favorite stock off his old workbench or off the wall in the old barn. It's important to have these saws because they enable us to make that last pruning cut that we would consider before moving to actually gasoline or even electric equipment like what is offered today. These saws here, while they look very similar, are different to some regard. When you're purchasing your pruning saws, one of the things I always advise folks to look at is the newly designed and improved tooth design that we see in recent years of saw design. Basically, the teeth are designed to point in opposite directions. This allows for a wider groove when the pruning cut is being made, and the clean out of rosin or other material that would normally stop up or make our pruning draw stroke very difficult is easily removed in these new style teeth. That being said, you can see the blade on this one is somewhat curved. The blade on this is very straight. Each have their unique application within the tree or the plant that we're working with. You might find that with a straight blade, horizontal cutting or cutting that's at or below your chest level is very easy. What's nice about the curved blade, and each of these saws are designed only to cut on the draw stroke. So basically, with a curved blade, anything above chest height, working above your head, maybe far above your head, these type of blades enable us to push up through the material without actually pushing that limb or branch away from us. And then with the draw stroke, cuts down into the groove and continues the cut. So with every movement forward, no cut is made, no movement is occurred in the top of the tree, and with each draw stroke, we make it more successfully through the cut we're trying to attempt. Once again, we can see this is easily larger than 2 inches in diameter. It's a situation where my loppers would not be suited for this level of pruning. Would I grab the chainsaw? Quite possibly if the limb was a little larger, but the speediness and the ability of these saws to really work quickly do make for a nice quick cut. That being said, this branch extends out as much as 10 feet away from me. That's a lot of weight. And if I go to cut and just start cutting from the top, what will result is if this limb splits away, it can actually, its bark will maintain here on the base and be drawn and or ripped down the trunk of the tree. I don't want that to happen. So ideally, my last cut will be here at the branch collar. But ahead of that, I'm going to make an undercut or a score cut, and basically in just 3 to 5 short strokes, I've now underscored a nice groove below the weight of this branch so that as it travels down, it won't rip and tear the bark as it comes off the tree. Now, rather than still trying to make that cut back here at the branch collar, I'm going to remove the weight. It's a three-part process: the underscore, the weight removal, and then I'll come back and make the proper pruning cut against the trunk. So pruning cut number 2 to remove the weight. You can see how quick this little saw makes through large material. It's now time for pruning cut 3. We've underscored, we've removed our weight. We're going to look here and start at the top of our cut, basically at the line of the scaffold branch is continuing down. I look for a moment to see where my branch collar is. The branch collar is the wrinkling of bark that occurs underneath a limb on a deciduous tree or one that drops its leaves regularly each year. And I can see that the outermost wrinkle is slightly out to the front right here. So I'm going to cut from that straight point up above down to my outermost wrinkle to remove this stub. Now I have a wonderful example of a properly pruned scaffold branch. We were able to remove a much heavier, awkward branch that was interfering with traffic. We took it off in the 3-limb cut system of underscoring, moving out, removing the weight, and then finally working back to the branch collar. It's our hopes that in the next 30 days or so, this branch collar, which all that wrinkling is callus wood or callus tissue, it will quickly start to roll over this pruning cut and wall off and separate any potential for disease to access it in the upcoming months to come. In any pruning practice, it's important to keep your tools clean as we're going through the necessary cuts and removal of either dead, damaged, or diseased material. With that said, rather than a spray bottle, which is certainly acceptable, of an alcohol solution or even your favorite mouthwash, I choose to use a plastic baggie like what we have here with a sponge inside saturated with normal household alcohol. This allows me to keep it in my pocket, and before I move from a diseased limb to another portion of the tree or the shrub that I am taking my pruning cuts in, I'll take a moment just to take my pruners or my shears and wipe down either side of my blades with the saturated sponge of alcohol. An excellent way of having your availability, say if you're up in the tree and not having to reach for that spray bottle, you just pull it out of your pocket, wipe your shears down, and you're good to go again. Typically when those diseases blow back into our home landscape or our orchards, they can be a real problem if the trees have open wounds or pruning cuts on into the spring of the year. In fact, we have a deadly bacterial disease called fire blight that during those early April, May periods can be devastating in apple and pear if there's wounds for it to gain entry into the tree system. So by choosing a date in February, early March, it takes us out of that disease triangle and enables us to concentrate on getting some corrective pruning and necessary pruning that maybe Mother Nature has thrown at us with winter breakage and ice damage, as well as looking over that tree to see if there's any lingering material that has made it through last year's season. As we saw in the pruning cut here above, we want to leave or provide an area for that tree to wall off and callus over as quickly as possible from the wound that we've created. Behind us though, and lower down on this tree, we see some areas of wood and damage that has occurred previously. These are the type of areas that you absolutely want to address. The sooner, the better. Never do we want to leave loose or broken bark that is attached or still attached to the trunk. If in fact we have a callus system or a callus roll that has begun to roll over and wall off the wound, rough, unattached bark, material like that does nothing more than to harbor insects inside. It's like a free little insect hotel. It also traps water and moisture in that same area where the tree is trying to heal, allowing disease organisms to more easily make their way in beneath the bark layers. So anytime we have a tree, whether a landscape tree and or a fruit tree such as apple, pear, peach, and you have this type of ragged material left behind, this is what we would like to prune off or remove to allow for that smooth encapsulation or that smooth walling off of material, so that in one day we don't even see the damage or the potential removal of this branch. We might not see that cut location in years to come. Pull that down and off. And this is exactly why, if we can get a close-up right here, behind that piece of tattered and torn, partially branched material, but for the most part just old loose bark, I have insects, I have secondary decomposition insects and stuff that have moved in and made their home in the wood behind or in this crevice. Looking down here on the tree itself, we're well in nearly early afternoon here now, and the point is it's still wet and still moist from retaining this morning's moisture right here, and this is the type of environment that encourages disease or insects to enjoy and make their home in. Removing that material out and having removed this piece right off the tree, we can see behind the callus material that started up the wound and the callus material that was working down the wound, and how it is attempting to roll and wants to close this overall damaged location. It'll take years to do so, but at the same time, if we leave this type of material behind, it would only result in the inability for those rolls to continue the process. So then we're left with that open wound. If we choose to use a pruning sealer, in which cases many are designed either from a tar base or a petroleum base, what we've found in the research is that exposed cambium layers can actually be slowed in their progression or desire in the wound itself to wall off against that material. So there's one reason with regards to slowing the overall process. Two, or probably the more important reason, is that pruning seal, once painted on, tends to, as the season extends, crack, open, and creates that same loose bark potential or a similar situation where insects can get in behind it, water can travel behind it, and it softens and creates more wound wood behind the product itself. That being said, if you choose to use a pruning sealer, and I'm certainly not going to talk my grandparents out of using it, the fact of the matter remains, you have to be diligent and return to the wound yearly and make sure that you have a new coat and that you've sealed up those cracks and those openings that sealer in normal freeze and thaw cycles has resulted. A season or two ago, we demonstrated to our viewers the emerald ash borer and how destructive that particular insect was to the ash trees that we see in and around Floyd County and, quite frankly, all of Southwest Virginia. We've gone through 2 seasons of that insect's presence, and there are very few ash trees left due to its tendency to girdle and damage inside that layer of cambium just below the bark and really cut off that tree's transport and livelihood. That being said, for those of us that are pruning and we're out in the farm situation or we're walking fence line, I can't stress the importance enough to look up with regards to these ash trees. After 2 years of damage, ash are unlike oak and hickory that would tend to stand there with a strong trunk and plummet limbs here or there. In many cases, the ash trees are popping and busting as much as 15 to 18 feet up the trunk. This results in a dangerous situation for those of us that are out pruning and or felling trees in proximity to these ash trees. I've chosen this branch here to demonstrate to our viewers how easy we have control over creating the direction that our young trees grow. If we take some care in initial pruning and developing these branches in a pattern that best supports future fruit loads and development, we can reduce the overall pruning that's necessary in the tree later on. One of the easy things I can do is choose a bud that is on the outermost portion of the limb. Anytime I make a cut right above a bud, this will allow for the bud to grow in its desired location, or its desired direction. So in this instance right here, I'm going to make a pruning cut. It's going to be approximately 1/8 of an inch above the bud. It's also going to have a slight angle or angled slope to the cut itself. And once I make that cut, I now have a bud on the outside of this branch or on the outside of this limb that is going to continue growing out as opposed to growing in or in either direction up against the trunk. Now, ideally, I would spread this branch using a small piece of wood trim, possibly a clothespin even, but something spreading it out to approximately a 45 to 60 degree crotch angle. There's reasoning behind that as well. A limb properly spread to this distance or to that level of opening makes for about one of the strongest limbs that is supportive of a fruit load as well as ice and snow load. I want to make sure I have adequate branching in at least 2 or 3 directions around that tree. Then I make a decision. In the event, say I have a nice tall or what appears to be a good branch here, my concern is it's still growing directly over top of another. In the interest of pruning this tree correctly, I would come in, I'm snipping off some of these intermediate branches. I'm actually going to take that branch off. And now what I've developed is a basal limb, a system of limbs. I'm going to go 12 to 15 inches up and seek the next location to create my whorl or my general limbs out and around the branch itself. If I work 12 to 18 inches up and set my next set of branches, I'm going to actually take these next 2 off as well. It may just be a little added length right there, but it leaves me a nice branch towards the camera, one more so out towards me, one off the back, and one in the other direction. I can then continue to move up my shoot or up my young tree, removing material, and at another 15 to 12 inches, this is where I would like to generate new branches this season. Here's a problem. If I leave the very top, this strong supportive shoot, largely with this big fuzzy bud up on top, that's an apical dominant bud, or the apical dominant bud that's going to send this tree an additional distance straight up. If I want the shoots, or I want these buds to break approximately 15 to 18 inches up from my last whorl that I've created, I've got a whorl here, a whorl here, I want my next set of buds to break in this area, I have to make a decision to remove a portion of this upright shoot. And in this particular case, I'm going to come all the way down and cut, once again, just 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch above a bud. I've taken off the apical dominance of the shoot just to take off this spring, it's going to take several weeks for this bud to decide, oh, I'd like to replace that top bud and continue growing up. But in the meantime, what we've done is we've triggered this tree to break bud in this area right here. So once again, the next 15 to 18 inches, I should start to see these buds break, developing shoots like what we have here to give rise to my next series of limbs. Ideally, if we can start young and balance our trees with a scaffold or skeletal system like what we have here, we can avoid lots of unnecessary heavy pruning later on in that tree's life.